Russia opposed the deployment of Western troops in Ukraine, while Donald Trump criticized Joe Biden for restricting Ukraine from striking targets inside Russia. What does this mean for the future of the war and the security of Europe? Today we will discuss it with Jonathan Sweet, a retired U.S. Army colonel and military intelligence officer with 30 years of service. Colonel Sweet, welcome to our studio.
Hey, Sofia, thank you for having me on the show.
I'd like to start our interview with a statement from Donald Trump that came out just before our conversation. In it, he criticized President Biden for not allowing Ukraine to strike inside Russia. He also said that neither side has a chance of winning this war. What's your reaction to this statement?
Well, I think it's at one level, it's fair criticism. The Biden administration, while it did stand up beside Ukraine and help them in their initial defense, the strategy that they have of weakening Russia and providing just enough munitions for allow Ukraine to survive in the long run has contributed to this 3.5-year stalemate. Weapons that were provided like HIMARS and eventually F-16s were restricted as far as the use of their munitions firing into Russia. And that has contributed to part of the problem. As Mark Toff and I have written on several occasions, both in the Kyiv Post and also in the Hill, if Ukraine can't stop the flow of Russian forces into their country, and by that I mean interdiction, if they can't strike those targets where Russian forces are assembling in Russia prior to their arrival into Ukraine, it puts them in a terrible position as far as defending. And what you see right now is the result of that. 1,000 Russian soldiers are being killed a day, and they're being replenished every day because on the opposite side of the border, they reside, and they just continue to push them forward. So we would say in the United States, it's Groundhog Day for the Ukrainian defenders as they continue to kill Russian attackers.
Meanwhile, Russia continues to strike Ukraine with drones and missiles, yet during talks with Trump, Putin claims he wants peace. Today, even the American electronics manufacturer Flex, which is located on Ukrainian soil in the western part of the country, was under Russian attack. At the same time, Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief General Alexander Syrsky says Russia is redeploying troops from Sumy direction to Zaporizhia. What does this tell us? Does Putin really want peace, as he says in a conversation with the U.S. president?
Yeah, I think we have two different definitions of peace, right? Putin's version of peace is the complete capitulation of Ukraine. Their defeat, their destruction, the loss of Ukrainian identity. By that, he achieves peace because there is no more resistance by the Ukrainian people. The West looks at peace as the firing stops, the militaries stand down, and they agree upon a line in the sand that says on the east side of this is Russia, on the west side is Ukraine, and we will no longer continue to shoot at one another. So look, the war stops when Putin stops attacking. Ukraine's not going to stop defending. They're not going to stop resisting. It only stops when Putin stops attacking. The trick, if you will, the goal, the end state of any negotiations with Russia has to be getting Putin to the point that he stops attacking. And right now, asking him to stop and appeasing him with his demands hasn't worked. His cost calculus remains, in this case, undetermined. But it's certainly not going to be measured by the number of casualties that he inflicts upon his own country, which today is over 1,074,000 Russians who have been either killed or wounded in the last 3.5 years.
I would like to ask you also about Russian attacks on NATO soil. Russia has attacked Poland with a drone that crashed roughly 100 kilometers from Warsaw. This comes as Donald Trump is pushing to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia. And can this incident be seen as a violation of NATO airspace? And why was there no response?
It could be seen that way. I just don't think NATO wants to see it that way. Look, this isn't the first time that a Russian drone or ballistic missile has landed on the Polish side of the border. It's certainly not the first time one has impacted on the Romanian side of the border. Okay, this war's been going on for 3.5 years, and it has happened multiple times. What NATO should be concerned about is that it continues to happen. Russia continues to push the bounds of the distances in which they are targeting Ukrainian cities. Okay. And yes, it could have been an overflight. It could have been malfunction. It could have been shot down and drifted over. But the bottom line is it impacted in Poland. They impacted in Romania. And NATO should be concerned that their air defense systems are not acquiring these drones and ballistic missiles in the air before they enter their airspace. And I think that's telling. And it may even be at one point or another Russia testing NATO air defense capabilities. So I mean that's the extreme. But the more important part is NATO has not been able to shoot these systems down. And it's almost as though if they don't acknowledge it happened, it never happened. So they do not, again, want to confront Russia by challenging them or by shooting down those particular weapon systems. So it's certainly a diplomatic problem. It's a military problem in the long run. But it continues to happen, and Russia continues to push the envelope.
Since you already mentioned that it was not the first time Russian drones have crossed into NATO territory, doesn't the repeated lack of reaction risk making NATO look weak and giving Putin a green light to keep crossing the so-called red lines?
It certainly emboldens him, and it could encourage him to continue to press the envelope to see what the NATO reaction is. Right now, I think it's clear that NATO doesn't have a secure air defense network that can stop ballistic missiles or even drones, for that matter, from entering their country. And that could be something that Russia takes advantage of in the future. I don't think they'll do it within the next 6 months, but it could open a door for opportunities, if you will, by Russia to threaten the NATO alliance, and not just in Poland. Obviously, the Baltic states are clearly one of the targets that Putin has mentioned before.
There is a lot of talks now about a possible face-to-face meeting between Zelensky and Putin, with Switzerland and Hungary even named as potential locations. What do you make of such meeting, and what can be really negotiated with someone accused of war crimes?
Yeah, I don't make much of it at all, to be honest with you. Look, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov just said 2 days ago that they're not going to have any type of negotiations, direct negotiations between Putin and Zelensky until the culmination of negotiations has occurred. Therefore, meaning that until Ukraine culminates and is to the point where they will sign a peace treaty, Putin has no desire at all to talk with Putin or with Zelensky. And I think part of that is there's a mentality, obviously, in Russia, and we see this a lot on the Telegram channels. Putin's often referred to as grandpa in his bunker. And ultimately, I think Zelensky strikes fear into Putin. Zelensky is the only man so far, the only European leader to stand up to Putin, to actually attack Russia and to threaten his regime. So I think at one level, Putin's afraid of Zelensky, and he certainly wants to bring him down. He wants to humiliate him. And the only way in which he's going to meet him is as a defeated leader. He's not going to give him equal status. And I don't believe we're ever going to see these two come together, even in the presence of President Trump.
If there is no meeting between Zelensky and Zelensky and Putin, do you see a potential move from Trump's side? I mean, I'm talking about sanctions against Russia, which he was calling for, I don't know, more than 2 weeks now.
Yeah, longer than that. No, look, sanctions have always been on the table. The problem is the president isn't prepared to pull the trigger on the sanctions. The president wants to give Putin every opportunity to come to a peace deal. Or at one time, the discussion was to have a ceasefire, but Putin was able to talk him out of a ceasefire and get him into this world of peace deals. And peace deal meaning we'll continue to fight until Ukraine surrenders, I believe. No, I just I don't think that's going to happen. I just don't.
I would also like to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine. Right now, several scenarios are on the table, from continued military support to a troop presence and a NATO Article 5 style model of security. But it's clear that Moscow wants veto power over these guarantees and basically now are blocking the deployment of troops. Where do things stand at this moment?
Yeah, look, I think the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, the other day said all the details have to be hammered out still, and he's right. The details have to be hammered out, but it's not likely it's going to be what you and I consider to be security guarantees, because Russia has stated unequivocally no NATO forces on the ground. Okay, so I'm not sure how you get beyond that. I mean, what guarantees can what NATO-like Article-like guarantees can be provided if you can't put boots on the ground? Look, and the reason why they don't want boots on the ground is that NATO forces would become a speed bump to Kyiv. Okay, it serves as a deterrent. Russia does not want to be involved in a direct engagement with NATO. If NATO forces are on the ground, they would be. They know if they engage NATO forces that they would be defeated. So that outcome is something that they will not accept. Okay. Article 5, like security measures, I'm not sure what that means. It's not defined. But I'll tell you this, it's certainly not what the Budapest Memo provided in 1994, which provided security guarantees as well, which didn't survive 2014 and they didn't survive in 2022. And the reason why is they were non-binding agreements, okay? It was not a security treaty, okay? It was a wall of words that at the end of the day, neither side acted upon. Now, look, the United States and Great Britain did provide weapons, but the United States and Great Britain never provided a winning strategy. And getting back to that first quote that we talked about earlier with President Trump, we still don't have a winning strategy. The strategy we have now is make it stop. It is not going to stop. And I'm not sure why people in the West, particularly Western leaders, don't understand. Stopping is not in Putin's calculus. At the end of the day, there's only one outcome for Putin, and that is the complete and total capitulation of Ukraine. Then to reset, to rearm, and to look at what other territories that he would like to reclaim. And Moldova's got to be at the top of the list as a non-NATO EU country, as would Georgia. And then eventually he's going to look a little further north, I believe, to the Baltic countries, hoping to put a divider between NATO and the Baltic states.
But from your perspective, how realistic is it for Ukraine to expect guarantees that would include an actual international military presence on the ground? I mean, if Russia does not support this idea, I think it's impossible, basically, to have it.
I just don't think it's going to happen. Look, Russia's just recently mentioned the use of Chinese forces on the ground as a neutral party. Come on. China is not a neutral party. North Korea is not a neutral party. Iran's not a neutral party. Okay, so ultimately what's going to happen if you have security guarantees is that you agree upon, again, a line. This line is the border. On this side of the border is NATO. On this side, it doesn't have to be NATO, but NATO forces occupying Ukraine to provide that deterrence. Russia does not want a deterrent. Russia is setting conditions today for follow-on operations in the future. We've seen this in Chechnya. We've seen this in other places that Russia has been involved. It's a pause until they can rearm and reset and do it again. If forces are on the ground, they'll have to fight through those forces, and they know they cannot do that, okay? Even an air type of defense, okay? When I say air defense, I mean air patrols. I mean a no-fly zone. At the end of the day, that is simply going to be a demonstration, because I cannot imagine that the United States nor NATO would authorize its pilots to retaliate or to get into a direct engagement with NATO, unless it's a binding security agreement in which those countries have forces on the ground at risk. It's too easy for them to not follow through on words, not treaties.
Russia also says that any security guarantees should involve China and Russia itself. What would China's role mean in practice, and why Ukraine and Ukrainian people should trust Russia, which has already violated previous agreements?
Yeah, I wouldn't trust Russia. I mean, we know that from 2014 to today, they violated 25 ceasefire agreements. I wouldn't trust China either because we know that China's been providing Russia military assistance. Okay, maybe not necessarily in the form of hardware, but they have been providing a technology in the form of dual-use components to build their missiles, their rockets, their tanks. And they've also, if you remember, okay, the relationship China has with North Korea. North Korea doesn't get involved with Russia unless China gives them the authorization to do that. I think we all understand that. So China has been complicit in all of this, putting Chinese forces on the ground. Oh, by the way, Chinese forces have been on the ground because we have seen Chinese casualties on the fronts. Okay. So it's not like China is an independent broker. China wants to get its hooks in there because China is working on relations with Europe. Okay. And they think, and rare earth materials. We've seen China go after rare earth materials all throughout Africa, and they would love to have access to rare earth materials that exist in the Donbass region. So China's not a good call for anybody except for Russia. And if the United States honestly believes that they're going to put some type of divider between Russia and China, that it's simply just not going to happen.
Colonel Sweet, thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. These are complex and fast-moving events, and your perspective help us better understand what's really at stake for Ukraine, Europe, and the world.
Well, thank you very much. Look, I do believe there is an outcome, but it can't be relied upon Putin to do the right thing. You're going to have to force Putin to do something, and right now the West isn't prepared to do that. So I look forward to the day at which all Ukrainians can live in peace and stability. Thank you for having me on the show.
And to our viewers, if you found this conversation useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss our next discussion on the most pressing issues in international security.